That's a good sound. You know you're in for a treat when you hear that because it's time for another episode of the Rec Poker Podcast Forums Edition. I'm your host, Jim Reed, Bluffsterini in the home game and at Hold'em_Steelers on Twitter. And I am lucky enough to be joined by a panel of wizards to come and talk recreational poker strategy like we are every week. Wizards, tell the world a little bit about yourself and where they can reach you.
I'm Chris Jones, 5x5 on PokerStars and Twitter.
And I'm John Somsky. I'm Poker Geek MN everywhere.
I'm Rob Washam, and I'm Radman50 everywhere.
And last but certainly not least is Taylor Moss. In the Rec Poker home game on PokerStars, you can find me at GopherBoyTJM. Otherwise on Twitter, I'm at Taylor_Moss.
He's number 5 alphabetically, but number 1 in your hearts.
Exactly.
Just like every week, we are here talking poker strategy. We are playing in the Rec Poker Play Money daily home game on PokerStars that John Somsky sets up more than one a day average these days because he's a beast. And just like every week, we're going to pull one discussion post out of the Rec.Poker forums and talk about it here. So today, we're looking at a post by Michael. And the post is called "To Fold or Not to Fold Jack Jack." And as Rob reminded me earlier, just before we jumped on the air, there's only 3 ways to play Jack Jack pre-flop, and they're all wrong. And that is exactly correct. And here's the good example of how it's just hard to feel good about whatever you're doing with Jack Jack. So Michael says this one comes out of the home game, and he's just unsure if he played it correctly in real time. So it's early enough, the blinds are 3570. Hero is in the cutoff with 3,480 chips with the Jack of clubs, Jack of diamonds. So under the gun raises to 210, which is a 3x, and it folds to a player in middle position who calls. We get another caller before the hero. The hero is now facing a pot with 9 big blinds plus the blinds, and elects to call here. We will talk a little bit about whether this is a squeeze spot or a 3-bet value spot specifically, or if it plays well as a call. But as played, the hero calls. And then directly behind the hero, we get a shove from Shorzy00, Ben, one of our illustrative. Oh God, what did I just do there? Illustrative? No, someone help me out. Chris, you're a smart guy. Illustrious. Thank you. Oh my God, it's getting late here, and the Steelers are playing, but I'm saving the game. No spoilers. So Shorzy raises, he shoves, folds around to under the gun, who re-raises. It gets back to one of the callers in position who shoves as well. So it gets back to Michael, who has Jack Jack, is facing 3 all-ins, and while he has the table covered, it's going to cost about 3,000 of his 3,300 chips to call what would be a 4-way all-in. So right off the bat, we can talk about how to play in this spot. Should we call this 3-way all-in? And we can talk about whether we should have called or 3-bet in the first place. Does anyone have any thoughts right off the bat on how they might have played things similarly or differently? I always struggle in these situations because, just like Rob was saying, there's no clear correct answer. One of the commenters in here has obviously been reading along with the game plan, our book study group that we were running recently, and talks about how this is the kind of hand that, because you're in a stack to pot ratio where you are, this would just play sort of uncontroversially as a shove. How do people feel about that? Personally, I'm always tempted to shove Jack's pre-flop because you get to add some fold equity. You get to fold out some of those unpaired high cards that might be tempted to come along. In situations like this, you're not going to have the stack depth necessary to be able to profitably set mine with them. So you have to really think about, if I am calling, even in position, are there going to be flops where I don't flop a set where I can still take the pot away from a better hand? Am I, your options are kind of limited once the stacks get pretty deep, get pretty shallow like that.
So the hero in this case has about 48 big blinds. And then the under the gun raises to 210 big blinds. At that point in time,
3 big blinds.
Or 3 big blinds, 210 chips.
That would be a big one.
3 big blinds. Thank you.
Mhm.
So I don't think it really makes sense at that point. I think that's too big of a shove. You're really going to limit yourself to primarily getting called by hands that beat you. But I think a 3-bet would make perfect sense there. And given that the first raiser had about 1,300 chips, that would probably scare them off of trying to do a steal, unless they actually have a hand that they are willing to go with. So that's my first thing. I would tend to 3-bet. Playing with fewer players makes jacks a little bit easier to play. Maybe one of the least strong ways to play it. I don't know.
Yeah, and to like bring us back to square one on this, like we're at a spot we have 50 big blinds to start the hand. Majority of stacks around us appear to be around 50 big blinds, although we do have one that is considerably less. But we get an under the gun open to 3x. Then we get a call from middle position, another call from someone in middle position, and then us, I believe, in the cutoff, are now stuck with an action on what to do. So I agree with a lot of what John's saying here. Like, to shove 50 big blinds over a 3 big blind open is a little excessive. You're really kind of just forcing your opponent to play optimally versus you, and fold hands that are worse than you, maybe call some of those hands that are flipping, and for sure calling the hands that have you beat. But what I do really like here is a 3-bet in this spot. It puts a lot of pressure. We can get too worried sometimes around that under the gun open, because that under the gun open, whenever someone's opening under the gun, that should be essentially the strongest one action someone can take pre-flop is opening under the gun. It should have the tightest range, and you should respect it the most. But what we do have is we have 2 calls behind that kind of chop off some of the premium hands that they may have. Because if they have hands like aces, kings, queens, they're likely to 3-bet that open. Everyone plays slightly differently, but let's just assume that that's the case. Well, if that is, we can potentially, get some of those riffraff hands out that do potentially have us beat later on in the hand, but don't have us beat right now. They have some sort of equity versus us, but we can get them out of the hand and potentially go heads up. Because when I'm playing jacks, the last thing I want to do is play 4 ways. You're fading 3 overcards, and the more people you play hands against, the more likely all those overcards are to be covered, and making your pair worse. So I'm going to be 3-betting here 99.9% of the time, 100% of the time early in a tournament. And I don't think we need to go too big. Open was 3 big blinds. I'm probably targeting a raise size around 10-ish big blinds, given the fact that there's 2 callers behind. And I'm just going to put some pressure on not just that under the gun open, but also the 2 callers that were behind.
And I think, Taylor is talking, but this is a value squeeze here. And it's okay to have value squeezes in your range when you know you're going to fold to a shove. Not that I'm saying you would necessarily here, but you can make a value raise even with hands that you don't think are the nuts. And you just have to make good poker decisions later as people's ranges become more clearly defined. Taylor, do you have a cutoff in pocket pairs that you might go down to that you would consider to be a value squeeze here? Like, is jacks the bottom, or does it go down to 9s or 8s or something like that?
I'd probably do it with 10s, and then 9s starts to be where I would kind of put that cutoff. For sure with 8s, I'm not making a value squeeze in that spot. If the opens and calls were in later position, maybe, then 9s goes into the range, and then 8s kind of becomes the questionable part. But we do want to keep, the strong part of value in our range here. And I think jacks are, close to that edge, but probably should be in that range.
And there's some good comments here in the forum post as well from some of the different members. John Lutzy gets in a good point here that we'll get up to in a point. TV Stensby has a good point about how the as played, when it gets around to you, how tight some of those ranges might be. And I do want to draw attention to William, who has definitely the best looking avatar out of anybody in the Rec Poker forums. That something about that black and gold is just hard to go wrong with. Boy, that does look good, William. That's very well done, sir. So I'm with you, Taylor. I think it plays better, not only because Jacks is a powerful hand that benefits from playing heads up, but also because squeeze spots are good spots to be taking. And so, part of what your goal should be as a poker player is like expand the number of hands that you're three betting in a squeeze spot like this. Even if, you might not have the best hand, it's a good spot for a reason. It's kind of a cliche for a reason. So Jacks are a good one to have in that range, I think. We could talk about what happens after it's called and it goes around. Does anybody else want to talk about that three betting opportunity or that squeeze spot there, Chris?
I agree with what everyone said. I mean, I think this is a spot where we want a three bet, and unless we want to confuse, because I was in this hand, unless we want to confuse the person who's sitting next to you, because I did not put Michael on this strong of a range, and we can talk about how this hand played out. But I think it's an interesting hand. Sort of after he flatted, the shove from the button came from a player who was pretty short stacked, and I think, if I remember this hand correctly, had just kind of, I always look for someone who just kind of exited the previous hand under unfortunate circumstances, and that would be what happened to Mr. Shorzy.
Oh no.
So I was reading this as a little bit of a frustrated shove, and then the under the gun player took a really, like, I don't often take a ton into timing tells, but this felt like I was not reading this as somebody who was like it seemed really like a really tough call for them, and they did end up shoving, but I read both of them as fairly weak, and because of that I ended up calling all in, and really threaded a pretty magical needle here, because then Michael, which we'll talk about, folded his jacks, which I think is an interesting question, what we do with jacks when we have these three callers, and I think that's up for discussion. But I can tell you about the results after we have that conversation. But that was a good fold for me. Let's just say.
So you were to Michael's right. You were that middle position player. So you called the original open, and then when it got multi-shoved back to you, you released the hand. Did you? No, you.
No, I called both of the all-ins.
Oh, it would have been a good fold. Okay.
Yeah. No, he did fold.
He did fold. Yeah.
Yeah, he did fold, which was a good fold for me.
I see. His fold was good for you.
Yeah.
So let's put ourselves in Michael's spots here. So we had this spot where it got raise, call. We elected not to three bet, so we called. And then I think, from Michael's perspective, when it goes shove, call, or whatever it is, I mean, you must be thinking, that's why I didn't three bet, because at least one of these guys has, queens plus, and I'm so smart because I didn't waste those extra chips on this particular hand, and it is easy to put him in the muck. I think he's also, at this point, only committed 210 chips, which is a strong consideration when you're thinking about, yes, there's 8,000 in the middle, but, how often am I drawing to a two-outer to get it? Does it jump out at any of you that this is a spot just to auto call or auto muck with jacks?
I think folding is accurate. 3 ways, a multi-way pot. Is it 4 ways?
He would be the fourth.
He would be the fourth.
Yeah. 4 ways with a pocket pair like that. Even if you have the highest pocket pair around, I mean, I'd rather go to battle with a hand like Jack 10 or Queen Jack suited, that type, something that works better in a multi-way pot. And I think I'd fold those too with 4 people in the pot. I mean, it's just too much. The opportunity, like Taylor mentioned, the 3-bet pre-flop is where he would have eliminated all of that all of that action that happened after the fact would have never happened if he would have 3-bet.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there would have been it would have been totally a different scenario. One of the things that Chris said, though, he said that the person under the gun took a lot of time to make a decision before he jammed. And that's funny because when I've seen that happen in the home, especially in the home game, it usually means the person's very strong and is trying to make it look like he has a tough decision.
Yeah, I agree. There's sort of a really, I think there's a real nuance to that, right? Like I feel like when people take the full allotment of their time, that's some real strength. But when they take like a lot of time and then like just kind of like there's a few seconds into their extra time, but then they call, it's like there's this like in between time where I put that as like, this is not faking, this is tough decision time. And that's at least how I read those, at least.
Okay.
I'm writing that down, Chris. I'm going to try and balance the amount of my time that
like it's pretty obvious if you take your full, whatever, down to 5 seconds. Okay, you got, but like if you take your full time plus a little extra time, I read that as like you actually had something to think about here.
Yeah, I mean, we'll probably talk about this a lot at our TELS seminar, but a long time to think is, from my perspective, a very polarized range.
Yeah.
You're either doing it because you're really not sure, or you're doing it because you're trying to make it look like you're really not sure.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you're playing online, you're just distracted by the television or the cat jumped in your lap or whatever. So you do have to be a little careful about timing tells. They're the best you've got playing online, but they're also unreliable in that people can be distracted and you're not able to tell when they're distracted versus when they're just actually thinking.
And there is software out there that people can use that will automatically choose a random amount of time for their action, like a Table Ninja type thing that's meant for multi-tablers, so that you can't build that kind of tell. But most of the players that we're playing against in the Rec Poker home games aren't going to be randomizing to that level. So I think you can use something from the timing tells. So TV Stensby here, one of our international members, makes a good point about how he would fold jacks here. And again, we go through this in the audio, and we there is some video here, but you really have to go to Rec.Poker and look at the forum post itself to actually see. There's some great breakdowns in here, and I'm not going to be able to do justice to Tron Vidar's point here. But one of the things he says is that basically, even though the pot odds seem good, the actual EV will be controlled by your tightest opponent, which is a good point to take on this. And I think part of it's just because those tightest ranges are going to own most of the equity in that, even multi-way. Those are the hands you have to worry about. And with a hand like Jack, sort of like what Chris was getting at earlier, if you're able to kind of cap the range on a couple of those players, or to at least make it wide enough that they have a lot of hands that you wouldn't necessarily have in a nutted range, it's a very different EV calculation than if they're playing just typically, queens plus and ace king. Yeah, you're ahead of the ace king there, but you're not doing great against that entire range. So it kind of doesn't really matter what the other people in the hand have if you can say I'm one of them that has a good chunk of my stack, almost certainly has aces or kings or something like that. I'm not sure if it was the case here, but that's something from Tron Vidar that I want to draw attention to.
Yeah, and I mean, to take the hand out of question, just the way the action played out in this spot, we get an open, there's 2 calls in front of us and we call, and then it's followed by shove, call for all in, then it's back on us. Generally speaking, when that happens, unless when we were calling that first time around specifically as a trap, you can almost say 99% of the time, unless you were calling to trap, you should be folding in that spot. So if we didn't feel confident enough to 3-bet jacks for whatever reason, whether we didn't think it was going to be a good value 3-bet for us, or we thought someone had a tight range, it's like we forget about that thought that went into our head that ultimately led us to the call. And then when it comes back around to us, we get rid of that thought and we go, oh, well, I have jacks. Maybe I should call here. So there was something that went on that said, hey, maybe I should call this pre-flop, and then it gets back around to us, and then we're thinking, well, maybe I should call all in now. So it's kind of counter ideas kind of conflicting with each other here. And I don't think we're calling with jacks to trap in this spot. And I don't, like I said, 10 minutes ago or whatever, I don't really like playing jacks 4 ways. So yeah, I think this is a good discipline fold. I think it's unfortunate to have to make this fold, but it's a fold we should be making.
Well, let's hear a quick word from Jonathan Little, and maybe a couple of the guys can play some X's and O's or something, and then we'll wrap this up with some further thoughts.
Have you ever wondered whether you should call a preflop raise or 3-bet instead? What do you do when you have a flush draw? Do you raise it, or do you just call? What do you do with ace-king when you miss the flop? Are you tired of guessing about what the right play is with your particular hand? Well, my name is Jonathan Little, and I am a 2-time World Poker Tour champion and creator of PokerCoaching.com, where we offer over 1,000 interactive hand quizzes where you play a hand and then get real-time feedback from our world-class pros. Don't guess and don't stress. Just register for your free account at PokerCoaching.com/recpoker right now.
That's Jonathan Little, one of the big names in poker. Speaking of big names in poker, Steve Fredlin's not on the podcast tonight, but he loves poker and he loves helping small business owners with their small businesses. So if you or if someone you know is a small business owner, head over to smallbusiness.com and find another way for Steve Fredlin to work with you. So Taylor, I really like this idea that you're saying when you make a decision at this point in a hand, you have to be thinking ahead to what are going to be the other opportunities available to me in the future, and how am I going to be consistent with this decision. And I think people make this mistake all the time, where they look down at a decision point in the hand and they think, okay, here's my hand, here's the action in front of me, now I need to make a decision. And they're not factoring in the decisions that have happened already, the actions that have taken place on earlier streets or earlier on this street that have allowed them to narrow the range of opponents, or for opponents to make assumptions about them. Can you just speak a little bit more about how, and Rob, I know you want to jump in here too, about sort of the importance of planning that out, more than one decision at a time?
Yeah, and the way I view it, and Chris is going to really like this analogy because I've heard him say this before, but like a hand of poker is like a story, right? There's everything that happens that leads up to it. You don't get halfway through a story and just forget the intro to the story or what happened in the first 3 chapters. It's all a buildup. You got to take in all that information. You have to watch it play out and then use that. So to get to the middle part of the story and say, hey, here this is going on, what should our hero do? Isn't the right way of looking at it. Read what's happened up until that point. What has been the action? What have people been doing? What strength or non-strength has their actions shown us up until this, and make a decision based off of that. And I think it feels to me like it's like 2 disjointed thoughts that we had here. Although like we got to the right point ultimately with the fold, but to like I get the concern around it, but like at this point, once that action happens, it's a pretty easy fold, I think, in this exact spot.
And I think another thing you want to look at when you're getting involved in a hand is who's left to act and what is their chip stack. Obviously, the guy on the button had a very short stack, was very likely to be jamming. By you calling, you gave him all the incentive that he needed to do that. Had you 3-bet, he might not have done that. He might have said, well, I'm up against some strength here. I'm going to get out of the hand. So you need to anticipate what your actions are going to potentially have your opponents reacting to, right? How are they going to react to that? So when you're getting involved in a hand, you need to understand what are the stack sizes of the players yet to act, and try to understand how they could potentially respond to what you're going to do. Instead, basically you made a call, hoping to set mine with your jacks and to see what happens on the flop, right? Maybe I'll flop a set. That's basically what happened in this hand. for him to just make that call. So.
Yeah, and
ultimately,
I think, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, just ultimately, I think this becomes, we can talk about the results, but I think this becomes a forum post because of the results, because Michael gets to see the three hands that turn over, and I'll tell you, they're a little surprising. And jacks were, well ahead of all three hands. But I think we can't just look at this and say, did I make the right play? Because if I would have called this, I would have probably won this hand. Well, actually would have won this hand. And I think ultimately, though, what the lesson really is that this was a good disciplined fold. In most situations, when we make this fold, we're making the right fold. And sometimes we're going to fold jacks and everyone's going to turn over worse hands and we're going to kind of grit our teeth and we're going to move on. But ultimately, we're going to still know that we made the right decision. And I think that's what happened here.
Yeah, and it's a good reminder that you don't have to be right every time. And that's a foolish goal to set for yourself. You just have to be right more often than you're not. You have to take the action that's going to be right in the long term, profitable in the long term. And that involves folding with the best hand sometimes, and it involves calling with the worst hand sometimes. And, that is part of poker. That's what we love about it. That's what makes it great. So don't worry about being perfect, and don't worry about if they have aces. Think about the range of hands they could have, the actions that they'll take with that range of hands. And, like we said at the top, it's okay to make a 3-bet and fold too, if you feel like. I'm not sure if this is the spot for that, but there's nothing wrong with having that room in your range. All right. Well, any final thoughts on this post before we send it back to the Rec Doc Poker discussion forums? I thought there was some really good stuff in here, particularly from Michael, William, TV Stensby, and of course 5x5, John Lutzy, and some other good members in there. And just a reminder, you can go to rec.poker for free and get a free membership account to come and join the forums. Post your own hand histories there, and if we like it, maybe we'll even mention it here on the air. This podcast is sponsored by website AMP and the Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino. Thank you, Taylor Moss, Rob Washam, Chris Jones, and John Somsky. We'll see you next week.